to start this session, well, I want to say that Hartmut Rosa's theory of resonance is all over the place, and not just mentioned this morning, but it's very present in many of the presentations and of SIMM-practice and the research. But then we could wonder what being in resonance means in COVID times, and that's what we're going to hear about now during this session. And first presentation is given by Tina Huynh from the United States, California. So Tina, please take the floor.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I am originally from California, but I currently live in Seattle, in the state of Washington. My presentation is titled Refugees' Participation in a Community Choir During COVID. I need to bring it down, yeah. Okay. So I have a video to share with you first. This is a song that's called I'm Just Like You, performed by the Tacoma Refugee Choir. This choir is situated in the city of Tacoma, which is about 30 minutes south of Seattle, Washington, in the United States. The Tacoma Refugee Choir is a community choir whose mission is to welcome and support refugees, immigrants, and any community members with the express intention of helping refugees who would like to be supported into integrating into society in the United States.
This is my world.
The study I'll be sharing with you today focuses on a few members of this choir. COVID has exacerbated the struggles of many people, and in this study I was interested in finding out how COVID had affected refugees' sense of well-being and sense of belonging within the space of their choir community. Because of the context surrounding a refugee's life, including extended efforts towards social integration and language acquisition, refugees may have experienced the COVID quarantine and lockdown in a uniquely different way from non-refugees. This study helped me understand the personal struggles of participants and their desires of how they wanted to move forward during the pandemic. Adelaide Reyes-Stram defines a refugee as a person who has a sense of having fled their homeland as a result of coercion, a reluctance to leave, a pervasive sense of loss, of country, of loved ones, of personal possessions, of control over their own lives, and uncertainty over where they might finally be resettled, and uncertainty about prospects for return. Other scholars note that the term refugee also has other connotations, which you see on the slide. Finally, refugees are often thought of as voiceless and deprived of agency. In this study, I attempt to give these participants a voice by directly quoting their words. In the musical cultures and community settings, particularly in Western countries, there is the widespread belief that music as a fundamental human activity can contribute to the consolation and identity formation, and that choral music as an activity can bring about togetherness. There is a lack of literature regarding music of refugees, particularly in the United States. There is more literature to be found across European nations, likely because of the neighboring borders and level of geographic access. Among the literature that exists concerning music and refugees, studies reveal that refugees experience a sense of belonging, well-being, and cross-cultural communication in community arts groups. Groups are created to show political solidarity and for social inclusion. Music as social integration is often a key part to community music groups. Music is a primary way of healing trauma and negative emotions through forgetting, expressing hope, and reducing isolation. Lee Higgins asserts that the defining aspect of community music groups specifically is an act of hospitality, in which important non-musical conditions about membership, eligibility combine with an open approach. If you're eligible, then you are welcome, regardless of musical ability. This act of hospitality is central to the practice and empowerment process in community music. In the Tacoma Refugee Choir, pre-COVID, hospitality was embodied in a distinctive way. A large part of the choir activities was hugging. There was a lot of hugging when members arrived at the space, waiting for rehearsal to begin. Lots of hugging at the end of rehearsal as people sent each other off with a warm wish to have a good week. And the director had, as a result, written a welcome song that incorporated walking around and hugging in the middle of the song when the song called for it. So the hugging itself was an act of hospitality. It symbolized the idea that everyone was welcome in this space. I interviewed 5 participants, 5 refugees in this choir in March 2021 when rehearsals were online. They all had joined the choir at least 1 year before COVID and continued to participate through spring 2021 during the pandemic lockdown. 2 participants were from the Democratic Republic of Congo, 1 from Kenya, 1 from Nigeria, and 1 from Cambodia. Pre-COVID, there was a core group of 40 to 50 members who consistently attended rehearsals, and during COVID, a core group of about 20 to 25 members regularly met online. The choir very rarely used sheet music, usually learning orally. Writing songs together was a common practice, and they performed these songs live pre-COVID. The members helped each other in ways that built their community, including sharing resources for attaining citizenship, housing, food, clothing, transportation, and learning English from each other. Rehearsals were not only a place of music making, but a social space, a place where refugees and immigrants could integrate into society. The research questions were, did transferring to online rehearsals affect the participants' sense of belonging in this choir? How did the online transition affect the participation? Does the choir help them overcome hardships? In what ways? Does the choir help them with a sense of empowerment? In what ways? Several themes that emerged from the interviews were the sense of belonging, and within that, the sense of safety, appreciation for diversity, feeling needed or a sense of duty to help others, sense of hope, empowerment, and the feeling that they were overcoming hardships with the support of other members. Here we can take a moment to read some key quotes from participants that conveyed these themes. This is a condensed slide for space, so I will point out the quotes for you from the left to the right, and then we'll go to the bottom. On the far left, concerning the sense of belonging, I wanted to know more about the other refugees and other things that they were doing that I didn't know. I felt like I could belong because I also was now starting to try and develop new talents. Regarding diversity within the group, in the middle quote, the idea that we could have something in common with all these people from all over the world was very warm. The sense of duty, of needing to be present to support others, is represented in a quote on the right side. If I'm able to maybe create that space, not even necessarily for me, but somebody else will come in, maybe from wherever they come, and find already something established as I found it. So I really think I need to put in more effort and keep strengthening the bond. Lastly, on the bottom, regarding sense of hope, one participant expressed, but what overpowers that difficulty of coping by leaps and bounds is the love I've gotten, the support I have from these people. I mean, it overpowers any darkness that I felt. The key takeaways were that a sense of belonging and well-being played an important role in why the participants joined and stayed in the choir. That COVID did not change this sense, even though they participated less when rehearsals transitioned into the online format. They expressed a desire for the choir to reflect themselves and appreciated that fellow members responded to their needs. Lastly, there was a sense of awe in the members toward the diversity within the choir, and a sense of hope and being needed, and a sense of duty to continue the goodwill. So when I am looking at the insights I've gained from the participants' voices and find themes that reveal how COVID has impacted their sense of belonging and participation in community choir, I'm guided by Adelea Reyes-Schramm's essential question posed back in 1990 when she first delved into the lives of Vietnamese refugees in the United States. She asked, "Is there anything to be gained from studying music in the context of the refugee experience?" What I have found is that the experience of displacement is one that forms how a person relates to the world for the rest of their life. How to rebuild as a part of a new community and fold the experience of civic life and social integration into a meaningful and rich experience. This community can be found through music. In being part of a community music group such as a choir, one can find a sense of belonging, hope, and the sense of being needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. So I would like to invite our UK friends, Rosie Perkins and Caitlin Shaughnessy. I pronounce it well, yes? And
thank you, everyone, for coming today and having asked to speak. So in the short time today, we'd like you to introduce you to a collaborative project between the Hansa University in the Netherlands, the Royal College of Music, and CW+, which is the partner charity of Chelsea and Westminster Hospital. And this project was funded by the Dutch Research Council. So the work in London that we're reporting on today happened during the pandemic and involved musicians connecting via Zoom with patients on the maternity wards at Chelsea and Westminster Hospital. So the work was part of the Pro-Mimic project, which builds on the practice development by the research group Lifelong Learning in Music of the Hansa University of Applied Sciences and the University Medical Centre, Groningen. Their work, Meaningful Music in Healthcare, known as Mimic, is based on a small group of musicians who play person-centred improvisations with patients and nurses in hospital settings. Their research has demonstrated that this person-centred music making can be put into practice effectively in a hospital setting, and that it provides meaning for all participants, the nurses, the musicians, and the patients. This is now being expanded, and at the RCM we decided to focus our strand on maternity hospital settings, especially for women who are hospitalised during pregnancy. This was partly because parental well-being is a main thread of Rosie's research, but also because being hospitalised during pregnancy can create particular stress and uncertainty. This was really exacerbated by the very limited visiting rights during COVID. So there's some evidence that music can help support parental well-being, so we wanted to explore this in relation to the Mimic practice. So the work took place in the Chelsea and Westminster Hospital, which you can see here. We had originally intended to do this in person, but the pandemic had other ideas, so we decided to move it online. So eventually, the Mimic practice was delivered over 4 periods, so these 4 labs between 4 or 5 days during 2021. During each period, the 3 musicians worked together in a small team to connect virtually to patients on maternity wards. All these musicians were graduates of the Royal College of Music, and they engaged in socially impactful work but were also trained as classical musicians. They were both all new to the maternity and the online contexts. In the Mimic practice, they were also trained specifically by a team in the Netherlands, and that included learning about perinatal mental health, the underpinning research and practical work, and how to develop their own Mimic practice. The musicians were able to access the call from the RCM, and the patients accessed the same Zoom call via their mobile or tablet, which was supported by a mediator who was on site at the hospital. A research associate, Lee, was also on the call, but muted and camera off to provide support and kind of observe what was going on in the sessions. Each session lasted between 1 and 2 hours, but with each individual patient joining for about 10 to 15 minutes each. Patients were asked individually, the mediator went around the ward to ask if they wanted to join, and then joined the call individually as well. During the visit, the musicians would make music following the kind of personalized mimic approach with each patient. So this would involve kind of asking what sort of mood they would like the music to evoke, or whether they would like to offer a particular stimulus, such as an emotion or a place, or sometimes propose baby names, and to create this personalized improvisation. We worked with over 33 patients over the course of the project. While we did evaluate some of the participants' perspectives, today we'd like to focus on the experiences of the musicians. Our aim, as you can read on the screen, we developed understanding the musicians' perspectives through the lens of vocational habitus. Vocational habitus is defined by Colley and colleagues as to develop not only a sense of how to be, but also sensibility, the requisite feelings and morals, and the capacity for emotional labour. The aim was to investigate not just how the musicians entered this new field of the online maternity context, and how through interacting with other professionals, they developed a sense of how to be and the feelings and the morals that were involved in their work. We collected the data from musicians in these kind of 3 different ways to understand the perspectives in terms of vocational habitus, which was reflective journals that the musicians kept during their journey, the focus groups at the end of each lab, as well as one-to-one interviews at the end of the whole project. And the analysis approach that we took was a qualitative synthesis, which was informed by vocational habitus, so taking all the data together.
So the musicians' experiences and their perceptions of what makes the right person for the job in this context can be grouped into these 3 main areas that you can see on the screen. Starting with the first area, connecting and empathizing through music, the musicians described forming and valuing connections with participants as part of the values of this work. The online setting posed some challenges to this, such as some participants preferring to keep their cameras off. As one of the musicians described, quote, "The most rewarding session was the lady who returned the next day because she felt comfortable and turned her camera on. That was really amazing. Certainly for longer-term patients, it's a really lovely idea that you can build up this rapport with someone." And this sense of connection was also important within the team of musicians. For these conservatoire graduates, a little like here at SIMM perhaps, it felt important to be forming connections with other musicians who shared similar values. In their words, quote, "To have a group of all women, to all have the same attitude towards our role as an instrumentalist, our role within industry is really nice. To have that open-minded, what can I do as an instrumentalist to bring joy to people is really positive." And finally, the musicians pulled out the importance of empathy when connecting through music in this online space. And as part of this, they commented directly on the development of a changing habitus, moving away from, as one of them said, perfectionism, and towards, quote, empathy, focusing on in the moment, feedback from the participants to steer the musical encounter. The second area was communicative and musical versatility. When speaking about their experiences on this project, the musicians highlighted learning new ways of communication that became embodied in how they delivered the practice. For example, one musician reflected on the sometimes difficult moment at the start of a Zoom call. She reflected, quote, "I think we kind of refined the language. We worked out which ways of explaining worked best or were least confusing. Before, we've been guilty of massively overloading participants with too many choices, places, emotions, highs, and all of this at once." As Dave mentioned yesterday, this practice is very situated. And when it's online, this introduces the need for forms of social and musical communication that had to be worked through and developed by the musicians. And all of this fed into their dispositions to becoming flexible and adaptable in the moment, skills that, of course, we recognize from many SIMM contexts. And the musicians juxtaposed these with some of their previous educational and professional experiences that they viewed as less expansive. All of this linked into a third area, rethinking and developing a sense of self as a musician. While working on the project, the musicians reflected on their own values regarding the impact and place of music. As one explained, it was a timely reminder of this is the impact music can have. As this musician reflected, their experiences on the project shaped their own enthusiasm for the social impact of music. The emotional fulfillment gained from the experience also allowed a reconnection with the idealized habitus of becoming a musician and the impact that it can make. The value of these experiences went further than the skills and professional satisfactions sometimes associated with being a musician, focusing instead on creating personal human connections. Quote, "It just reminds you about actual real life. I think, as I said before, getting away from like musician head, it's about putting the connection first, and the music is to aid that connection, rather than music for the sake of music." The project was regarded as a way to recognize and get away from these dispositions that they associated with a musician head. And this meant a shift towards connections through music, rather than prioritizing a musical product. For this group of conservatoire graduates, MIMIC involved navigating the interactions between the embodied habitus of classical music performance and the embodied vocational habitus of MIMIC, where music is personalized, connective, and impactful for both music maker and listener. Importantly, in both contexts, musical excellence is viewed as essential. These values were highly integrated in what was required to provide an effective MIMIC practice, as well as the fulfillment that the musicians experienced undertaking this work. The insights I shared were all shaped by the online nature of the interactions in this project. Reflecting on previous in-person hospital work, the musicians reported that working online enabled their interactions with patients to be more intimate and less subject to the distractions of a busy hospital setting. There was, of course, some concern for technical elements, quality of sound, internet connection, but these were outweighed in the musicians' experiences by the opportunities that emerged. The fulfillment from these online interactions was described as unexpected, and the musicians noted clear contrast to their experiences in previous hospital settings. Online delivery supported the musicians to create an intimate musical space with the patients, which they could experience through the privacy of headphones. One musician said, "This is the first time I've had meaningful music connections over Zoom. I love not interrupting people in their beds. Them having the choice, for me, made it really enjoyable." So moving to close, while this paper refers to a really small group of conservatoire-trained classical musicians, there are implications for musicians working in other professional contexts. Heidi Westerland and Helena Gaunt have noted that there's a need to support the next generation of musicians to fulfill, quote, "their societal responsibility and promise as game changers." And the responsibility for this lies between multiple agents, including the musicians, the institutions they receive training from, and in this case, the healthcare setting. So these educational and professional opportunities for musicians need to respond to this imperative. So I'd like to finish by thanking and acknowledging the wider teams, both in London, especially Dr. Andrew Hall at CW+, as well as the fantastic team of collaborators in the Netherlands and at the many partner institutions. And I'm looking forward to discussing a little later.
Thank you very much. Thanks to this hybrid format of the symposium, we can go to the other side of the world. And welcome Andrea Rodriguez from Colombia and Veronica Talellis from Argentina.
Hello.
Hi.
Our names are Andrea Rodriguez from Colombia and I am Veronica Talellis from Argentina. We met at the 2019 SIMM in Bogotá, Colombia.
Of March 2020, we reconnect at the beginning of the pandemic and talk about how our families were doing and what we were doing to sustain cultural activities in our organization virtually. We start to talk about our questions. At that moment, we shared that we had both started a virtual choir experience. Veronica in a choir where she was the coordinator in Argentina, and Andrea, me, as an attendee at one in the UK, and that perhaps we could answer our questions by approaching a real-time research exercise.
One of the choir is located in the city of Buenos Aires in Argentina. It is called Agrupación Coral Porteña, ACP, and it is under the direction of Maestro Pablo Quinteros. It was created in mid-2009 within the framework of the Coros Porteños program, which itself is under the auspices of the Ministry of Culture of the city government. The other is a choir called Landscapes of Latin America, LOL Choirs, which has carried out its activity in the City of London since 2013. This is a private initiative undertaken by the musician Camilo Menjura, an accomplished Colombian artists living in the United Kingdom. The two choirs thus share not only a type of repertoire, but also their objectives.
The research question was, what were the transformations in the artistic and relational dimensions of the virtual choir experience during the pandemic, and the reasons for continuing in the ensemble despite these changes? Although the study was carried out using an ethnographic approach, and therefore, from a qualitative perspective, it was fully remotely undertaken. The study was carried out over the period from March to October 2020.
For this research, we take as a theoretical framework the central concept of experience and liminality or liminal space. Recovering the definition of experience elaborated by Dilthheim, Victor Turner asserts that an experience is completed through its expression, through a performance. In this sense, Turner articulates the Dilthheimian theory with a proposal structure postulating experience as a rite of passage. Also, Turner takes the category of liminality and the description made by the French scholar Van Genep of the three phases that define rites of passage: separation, limen, and reaggregation. For the purpose of our analysis, we are interested in looking at the attributes that both author Van Genep and Turner give to the category of liminal space. The reality of the liminal state gives weight to the possibility and to unthinkable possibilities. With liminality, new ways of acting, new combinations of symbols are tested to be discarded and approved. It is in this state that Turner recognizes the relevance of experience. In this sense, this author have identified the value of experience as a central element of the current choral space, as it is the locus where paradox are being negotiated. The COVID-19 pandemic imposed changes in the social dynamics and therefore among these two musical groups. Some of the participants referred to it as a borderline situation which they had no choice but to face. This meant that the conductor of each of the choirs, almost against their own will, have to come up with new ways to keep their group afloat. As a result of all of this, each of the directors sought what technology could offer them. Some difficulties in current technology are polyphonic singing, sound delay, keeping participants on board. The directors and participants had to adjust and negotiate with what they knew of their role, as well as the imaginary of what a choir is. We will analyze what the introduction of technology and mediation generate in the musical and relational experience.
Fabrizio's testimony and that of other choirs shows us the destabilization of the previous rewarding experience in contrast to missing the live singing, the loss of the collective sound and spontaneity of music made live, discomfort with one's own voice, evidenced by having to sing in front of the camera or when recording videos, missing the human and rhythmic contribution of the conductor hands, that organic action-reaction of the choir with the conductor. In contrast, although this new time was considered more solitary, the testimony of Nancy and others present positive elements of the process of making music as achieved under these conditions. The enjoyment of making music is kept alive in spite of the adverse conditions. Increased weekly time devoted to choral practice both individually and as a group. Extra rehearsals between choir members which strengthened the musical and relational aspect of their choir. Increased body awareness both of their voice and image.
The participants agreed that the virtual version of the choir succeeded to a significant extent in satisfying their desire to be close to their peers, feel continuity, having something to look forward to during the week. Some of the members of the choir expressed that were it not for the dynamic that the virtual mode offered, they could not have maintained their relationship with other people in the choir. In contrast, some participants considered the experience as incomplete, although the virtual space was a solution to the impossibility of meeting in person, as a further electronic challenge in order to meet with others, finding the energy to come across well before the camera on. In this sense, the relational space reconfigured in virtual form has managed to meet the emotional needs of the participants by becoming a safe place of emotional relief, where the possibility of talking about personal situations has become a motivation comparable to the music.
I think to me is seeing the Las Tanaderas. It's not a rehearsal, but it's seeing the end result and what we could do this showed us that we could actually do something even though everyone is at home by themselves. That was really special to see. Really, really nice. And plus, I really loved that song. So it was such a nice song to listen to and to learn as well. So, and seeing the result with everyone else singing it was really special.
Hence, we understand that in the videos there is an evocation and at the same time the closest experience of the memory of the choir as it was before the pandemic. It is in this production where the choir is recreated, where a result is felt and made concrete. Collective music, where the feeling of singing with others, belonging, is revived, where the virtual experience of the choir makes sense.
Based on the above, we found the virtual choirs to be a space where a series of paradoxes are framed, which in turn reveals the transitional moment for the choirs at that time, but also for society. In consequence, the contradictions of that moment are also expressed in the ambiguous space of the choirs, of being or not being, of being a choir but not being one, of using a determinate and indeterminate time and space, of being close on the screen but corporally physically distant, of the fact that the choir today is a routine when before it was the opposite. In this way, the choir is configured as a transitional space, a place between 2 points. According to Turner's idea, this transitional nature is typical of liminal spaces where contradiction, ambiguities, and mediation are possible.
We also looked at the transitional space, which is where experience is lived out and where the negotiation of the emerging paradoxes took place. On the one hand, the sounds made by the group and the acoustic sensation were trade-off freely of personal achievement for continuity in the musical making, the singing itself, and for the collective satisfaction achieved through the videos. As regards the relational proximity with others was negotiated in exchange for emotional support. In this way, we show that in the midst of a pandemic, amid so much uncertainty, the choir became an anchor, a reference point of stability and normality, in contrast with the instability of the environment. Finally, we want to emphasize that what has been analyzed above unfolds and emerges between the past, the present, and the expectation of how the future will be. In short, people stayed in the choir because they were able to negotiate their expectations vis-a-vis musical and relational expectations, and what they found was enough to generate a rewarding experience in the midst of the pandemic.
Hello. Thank you so much. I don't know whether you here out in the space could see it, but my face. But I'm completely astonished. I was completely astonished to hear your presentations. Where to start? I myself started to sing in a choir when the COVID pandemic broke out, and all the rehearsals stopped. And also, I have really, I must admit, personally, very difficult. It's difficult to imagine to make music through a Zoom connection, or and then to see some of in the presentations you gave, some of the incredible creativity that is coming out of to make something happen anyway. It's really amazing, and also what I'm amazed by the fact that many of these projects did not stop, and so it also, I imagine, says a lot about the incredible need there is to be able to continue. So maybe can you give some first reactions to this remark of me? Who would like to take?
Me?
Yes, yes, please.
Well, I have been working at the choirs since a lot of years ago, and when the pandemic times arrived, it was a shock for all of the member of the choir, no, the directors and the participants, and for 1 month we didn't know what to do, but the pandemic continued, went on, and so we have to thought what we do. What could we do? So we began to. We knew the Zoom, and we decided to make prove a choir, a virtual choir. No, and it was something unthinkable. Before the pandemic, because the choir is just in presence, no, to be with others and to think with others, and maybe thought in that moment thought a virtual choir with the how to say. It was something impossible, and the director of my choirs said that it couldn't be a choir. It couldn't be a choir because the choir is in presence. So it was a challenge for all of the people who integrate our my choir.
Thank you.
Sure, I will say that it was very difficult, as we all know, being in a choir online, right? You're singing to yourself, basically, which is very sad now that we think about it. But so we would get online, and I was participating in the choir before COVID. It started about a year before, as a member and also as a project scholar of the choir. When we went online, I continued to join weekly because we wanted to stay together. But we would see the director. She was at her piano, and she would sing through the songs, and basically it was a sing-along, right? And so when I interviewed the choir members that I did about why they continued, what struck me was the sense of duty that they had. And unfortunately, I could only choose one quote out of so many pages and pages of interview.
Sense of duty, you say?
Sense of duty. So several of the members said, I continued online because I didn't want the choir to fall apart.
I wanted to be there for others. When they showed up online, I wanted to be there for them to show that we're still here, that we're still together. I wanted to support others, so it really wasn't about I want to sing. It really was about I want to make sure that the choir goes on and continues through the pandemic. And that's what struck me, is that sense of duty that the members had.
I think comparatively to the other presentations where you all knew each other before, what we really found through the Pro-Mimic project was that the individualized nature of making those connections with just one person in hospital bed was quite important, and that actually if you're in hospital and you're feeling a bit rubbish, you don't want 3 musicians to pop up at the end like with their instruments. That's quite imposing, and actually to be able to have the distance of a screen between you also kind of facilitated more intimacy in that way, because you didn't feel like you were on the spot so much, I think.
But that's amazing, I think, because I'm one of the many Zombies now, and I can appreciate a lot of the online connections that I can make, but especially with people I know already, but I find it really difficult with people you don't know. So and I have difficulties imagining that you make music, that you make music for or with people that you don't know and that you're not with.
Yeah, and I think we can elaborate a little bit on the point that one of the musicians made during the presentation, where they had to just sort of develop this language in the way that they would communicate with someone that they hadn't met before. In many cases, the camera would be off, at least at first. And so finding a sort of script, they described it as, which felt very different than what they anticipated, which was to be in the moment and very person-led. But actually what they had to develop was a sort of script to enable that process to happen. So to build a rapport, to build a sense of trust, not to offer too many choices or put too much onto the patient in the first instance, but to develop a connection and then build the kind of person-centeredness from there. So a lot of the work for the musicians was developing that sense of how do we communicate in this space? How can we, in a short time with someone, build a connection that will allow us, that will facilitate that musical interaction? And that definitely took time, didn't it? You know, on the first day, it felt much harder. Those connections felt harder to grab and to grasp, and it took time for that, for the musicians, I think, to be in the space where they felt they were able to make those connections. And they drew very heavily, we should acknowledge, on the ways of working that were already set up within the Mimic project more widely.
Are there any questions or remarks in the room? Yes, can somebody bring the microphone?
Thanks everyone for really interesting presentations. I'm really interested to hear the panel's thoughts on this moment that we're at now. It seems like most of the research was done in the height of lockdowns and people were operating online. We're now at a different point where some choirs and groups are going back in person, others are still decimated. We're not quite post-pandemic, but we are opening up. Interested in your thoughts about what might stick, what might stay with the benefits, what might go back to how it was pre-pandemic, and just your reflections on learnings at this point in time, bearing in mind we don't have the benefit of hindsight. It's still so close, but I would love to hear your thoughts about that point in time that we're at now.
Yes, Bridie, and also it would be interesting to have research done in comparative research on the two periods, the pandemic periods and or before, during, and after. Who wants to react to this question of Bridie?
I'm happy to kick off. Thanks, Bridie, for the question. I think one of the things that was, I think, fair to say unexpected in our project was the sense of the meaningful connection that was allowed through Zoom, but also the sense from the musicians taking part that actually the online context was an opportunity rather than a hindrance. I think we all probably approached it thinking, well, we have to do this because we have no choice, and that the funding for the project was finite and we have to do something. And I think we approached it in that spirit and learned very quickly that actually there was a lot of affordances offered. So I see opportunities for us to continue online interactions and accessibility to music. Some of my other work with parents affected by perinatal mental illness also suggests that we can have very meaningful connections that can support recovery that are online. And of course, this gets past access problems, such as not being able to get to a session, especially when you have a young child. So I think there's a lot that we can draw from this. But I would also caveat that by saying that a lot of the push is towards going back to in-person. So there is a sense that if we can, we should go back to in-person. And that sort of discourse is driving some of the decisions now, I think. And I think it's important that this research helps to inform those decisions, because actually I think there's a lot of opportunity here for us to think quite differently about what musical encounters might look like and who can access them moving forwards.
Veronica or Andrea, you want to react to the question of Bridie?
Maybe Veronica is better because I don't know more about the choir in person, because the research was in the pandemic, but I know about the choir. The last week was the first presentation in person after pandemic time, but Veronica is in the choir now.
Yes, the choir in which I coordinate and I participate is a ACP, and we returned to a presential choir at the end of 2021, and it was a very great experience, no? Because all the people want to be in presence and missed this contact with the other and making music together in presence. But there are a lot of things that are rescued at this moment that happened in the pandemic. No, for example, the exercise of being singing in front of a camera. The people recognized that it was a very good exercise from to his technique for his technique, for their techniques, no, to they
for the vocal technique, yes. Yes, sorry, Veronica. Mm-hmm. Yes, in general, for musicians, was they could improve their technique, vocal technique, during pandemic, because was maybe the first time that they singing with other awareness about own voice. I don't know, Veronica, mm-hmm. Was this?
So it's this singing in front of the camera put in other place, no? Because the singer in the choirs, when they sing in presence, they don't hear alone, singing alone, no? Hear their own voice. So I think it's a positive.
Thank you. We have another question.
Thank you very much. I'm interested in the mechanisms of social and musical interaction when we're making music together, and especially in this mediated context. One of the ways I've found useful of thinking about it is the 4 or sometimes 5 fields of Thomas Torino. And what a lot of us did when the pandemic arrived and we had to go online was we stopped being live musicians and we all became recording artists, right? That seems to have been the case for some of you, but not all. I remember also an article in the SEM magazine about Iranian classical music and how that can work really well online because it's improvisatory and it doesn't necessarily require synchronicity with a pulse. So it's one of the few musics that could work really well live on Zoom because you didn't have to sync up. And I wonder, in your cases, what mechanisms of musical interaction seem to have worked well online?
I observed the community choir continue to songwrite. That worked particularly well, and the choir director was able to bring in songwriting workshoppers from around the world. So that was something that we didn't have before. We also have the choir has a high transient rate because people are coming into a place and then they decide to resettle somewhere else, right? Members moving to Texas or to Brazil or whatever it might be. And so we actually had members who were past members who were able to join online again. And I think that was something very special because then the new members got to meet the former members, which then continued this feeling of belonging and almost building of solidarity for the refugees and immigrants, even though we're now sort of a diaspora of choir, so to speak. In that way, that was a positive outcome. Thank you for asking.
I think for us, it was very much a sense because all the musicians were together in one room. It was the performance of delivering through Zoom that was new for them, and that sense of not getting live feedback all the time and how they adapted to that, which was very much to then focus on the dynamic within the space and the intensity of that kind of live shared music making dynamic between the three musicians, which was really important for then how the patient on the other end of the Zoom call responded to it. They were being welcomed into this very intimate but live shared music making space.
We have one more question.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I want to say about this question.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much because it's very important in the online format. As Veronica and me talk about this, the relational or the relational aspect was relevant. More maybe or no more or a bit more of the musical aspect. I want to say the breakout rooms, for example, were an important moment in our research. We found that the people consider very important moment speaking about this moment, the pandemic moment, the feelings and the situation. And in Argentina, the choir of belonging Veronica, and in UK, the people say the same. Was very important talk about the situation, and related to the musical aspect, the directors used a lot of forms, try to create the musical aspects, but I think was very important speaking about this panel, music in pandemic, the relevance of the relational aspect, and was very important for us thinking in impact of music, how these spaces were very important to support in a holistic comprehension for the people in this moment. Thank you, Lucas.
And yes?
My professional background is in midwifery and public health. And of course, there are massive amounts of possibilities of work with music. I'm thinking of all these babies listening to the sound through the amniotic fluid, you know. But one remark I want to make is learning online has been happening for a long time. In fact, pre-pandemic, for many years, musicians in Gaza who are locked in have been taught online by professional musicians in the UK. More recently, Trinity Laban has offered the long-distance learning program. And guitar, piano, singing, composition has been taught for many years online. It's just a remark.
Yes, Tina, you want to react to this?
I was ruminating on Bridie's question and thinking about the ways that we have found ourselves transitioning out or through the pandemic during this time as we transition together. We have to admit that there's been loss, right? We can't forget that there's been a lot of loss. People have passed away, so we lost choir members. People decided they didn't want to sing in person when the choir went back in person, even though they were, the choir tried many things, singing outside, doing concerts in the open air, finding large rehearsal spaces. So the choir did lose members. So going through the pandemic, there's a sense of loss. But despite that, the choir lives, because there are always refugees and immigrants who need help, and there are always people who want to help, and so the choir continues. And I think that's something that is important to remember, that we experience loss together, but we continue to transition out of the pandemic together as well.
So there's a question. Imogen?
Where's Imogen? Oh, yes. Sorry.
So we're all set for the next pandemic.
No, please no. Not that we're out of this one by any stretch, realistically. But thank you all so much for your presentations. I was just thinking about this rhetoric that was going around. I'm not sure how international this was at the beginning of the pandemic, of COVID being this great leveler, and everyone sort of being put in the same position. You know, we're all locked in, and of course, that is not the case. We were all locked in very different circumstances, and some people had their Hollywood mansions, and other people were 5 people in one room. But I'm interested in the way that moving these kinds of this kind of work online changes the power dynamics of those interactions, that you're in your home. That's a kind of immediate intimacy. Whether that's good or bad is up for debate, I think, and it's more complicated than that. But I'm interested in the effects of that kind of breakdown of certain barriers on the relational elements of these projects, and particularly on the power dynamics between choir members and directors. Thank you.
Okay, let's round up with this,
Sure.
reacting to this question of Imogen.
Sure. I would say that the choir director of the Tacoma Refugee Choir in particular, pre-COVID, she was leading very strongly. And she's a great leader, charismatic, passionate, all these wonderful things. She's a great speaker. So people are very drawn to the Tacoma Refugee Choir because the way she talks about it. And she also chose the music. She also had a strong hand in songwriting pre-COVID. But when we all went online, you're right, there was a different sense, because she couldn't control the things that, she couldn't completely teach or direct the way she used to. And so it did open up a lot of space for other choir members to bring in their leadership and their own expertise. So we would have sessions of people from different countries talking about their own songs and teaching those songs. And then we would also have breakout rooms, as our colleagues here mentioned,
breakout rooms talking about the racial tensions that we experienced in the United States, the death of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, anti-Asian hate, right? And so we were able to speak about those in places. This is a choir director who is a white woman and wants to help, but does not have that kind of experience when the refugees and immigrants and people of color have a lot of experience and a lot of stories to share. So this became, in addition to a space of singing and music making, a space for us to share our concerns and to support each other through these kind of social difficulties.
Thank you very much. We have to now round up, and I see that we get some questions online, but also one of Alessandro Mazzola, but I'm really sorry, we will have to stop this session at this point. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your presentations.